Who doesn't love clever food preservation tricks? We all dream of making food last forever. Well, maybe not forever, but a solid week would be great. Let's dive into some timeless hacks that were truly ahead of their era. So, putting your fruits in sugar to preserve them is an age-old trick that's been around forever. Are you interested in the know-how, though? Because it's actually a lot of neat little stuff working together to make sure you can get 1 or 2 days more out of that banana. So, first, we need to talk about a little something called osmotic pressure. Sugar tends to make an environment with a high amount of osmotic pressure, and this really draws water out of microbial cells, which includes things like bacteria and yeast. Microbes basically need their daily 8 glasses of water to live, or they'll die, and unlike us, they can't substitute that for a Coke and a cigarette. Sugar binds with molecules in water, and it robs those microorganisms of what they need to live. Pretty brutal, right? That's not sweet at all. I bet you didn't know how much sugar reduces it either, and your overall water activity actually goes below 0.85 plus. It also works as an antioxidant. What does that mean? Basically, the enzymes that are responsible for browning your fruit, ruining that perfectly ripe taste? Sugar gets rid of that. All in all, it's your go-to solution for making your fruits last longer, look better, and taste fresher also? Just be cleaner overall. Really just a pit stop for your fruit basket. Before the days of freezers and two-door fridges, we had cold cellars, which you may also have heard being referred to as root cellars. For centuries, this was pretty much the cornerstone of not just America, but global society as a whole on how to preserve their food. Why was that, though? Most modern freezers actually try to replicate the environments people had in cold cellars. The temperatures you'd find in these frosty rooms would go down to 30 degrees and 50 degrees, and that meant that enzymatic activity, the same thing we just discussed that browns your bananas bad, goes down heavily in vegetables and fruits. Cold temperatures basically do the same for microbes too. Stunted growth is bad for anyone, not just kids that don't drink their milk. Plus, cold cellars have really high levels of humidity. Moisture retention is a big deal for these things, you know. You don't give them enough of that, they're liable to die way before they need to. Yet you've also heard that too much of the stuff is bad for you. You've probably heard your parents say not to keep your apples too close or around too much air, or keep your onions separate. Well, that's because of ethylene gas. With too much moisture and not enough ventilation, the buildup of this gas and the release of it causes a lot of nasty cross-contamination. Basically, you don't want your fruits being bad neighbors, and cold cellars were such a nice neighborhood too. So no one's a stranger to the process of larding, but I think a lot of us just follow these things because they're generational, tried and tested tips and tricks we know work. Why do they work though? Well, if you've ever played FIFA or a Dragon Age game, then you know the concept of a defender or a tank. Lard kind of acts like that. It makes a protective barrier of fat, which melts away when you cook. But when you just coat it, it seals it from any outside exposure. This helps oxidation basically never happen, which means you don't get any nasty-smelling meat or spoilage. Meat needs to be juicy too, though. Fat helps keep a lot of that water and moisture in, because who likes their steak dry? Plus, did you know some organisms that spoil your stuff actually really just get off of air? Lard really helps choke them out. When we were living in colonial times and people were still immigrating to the South and West, larded meats were even a sign of luxury and were a big part of our culture. It was impossible to make those long treks without a supply of properly preserved and fresh meat. Curing with nitrates has been another way of preserving meat. They did 3 things, and they did them really well. Those were preserving your meat's color, killing off any bacteria, and enhancing flavor. Pretty good all-rounder, right? Turns out, we used to deal with a pretty nasty illness known as botulism, which happened thanks to the rampant growth of Clostridium botulinum in meat. Lots to pronounce, but the gist of it is that this foodborne illness goes bye-bye when you cure meat with nitrates. Myoglobin in meat reacts with nitrates to overall just wipe out scores of bacteria. It's a real bloodbath if you look at it through a microscope, really. What's up with the color thing, though? Nitrates can actually help keep your ham, bacon, or whatever it is looking really vibrant and fresh, and that's all because it's a damn good curing agent. Oxidation is a real pain, and it can happen to you or any food you love. Nitrates have become so common now that we actually can't tell they enhance flavor anymore, but they do. Try having meat with none of that stuff put in. You'll immediately be able to tell the difference. It's because nitrites break nitric oxide down and form flavor compounds with amino acids in meat. This basically is what enhances its umami flavor and is something that industries keep trying to do to push certain flavor profiles forward. They're after you. So I'm sure you've seen this in movies before, but clay pot cooling was a real thing. It's a pretty vintage cooling technique, but it just takes some smart advantage of the properties of clay. Since clay happens to be a material with more pores than it knows what to do with, water tends to reach the outer surface easily enough. Imagine really tiny channels of water that give a very slow but steady supply of water to the inside surface. Since the water is ultimately so little, though, it tends to evaporate and create an environment where it absorbs heat and turns to a vapor, something you may or may not know as the endothermic process. This evaporation is pretty much what creates a lower temperature and humidity inside the pot and helps create that natural refrigerator effect that made this such a genius way of preserving everything and anything all inside an easily transportable and carryable pot. This is still an active tradition in many parts of the world, but in America, historically, settlers used pots to keep waters and fruits cold and fresh before ice boxes were ever a thing. Ice houses were a pretty integral part of how food preservation worked for the better part of several centuries. Before we had the dawn of mechanical refrigeration, this was pretty much the standard way of how to do things. There were a few reasons too, because the icehouse format had been reformed and refined until they hit a blueprint that ticked every box. The ice houses we've come to see having widespread use were built underground, with really thick walls that were reinforced with layers of stones and bricks, sometimes even wood. They'd also be layered with things like straw, sawdust, or peat moss so that they'd be covered with insulators. The idea was to stop heat transferring, you know? Insulation helps keep thermal conductivity low, so heat doesn't really get the chance to creep into the house. Plus, while nobody ever expected these ice houses to last forever, they had one benefit over fridges, kind of. If the power goes out, you're on a countdown until it comes back or your stuff spoils. In an ice house, thanks to a concept known as latent heat of fusion, ice houses would stay cool on the inside as the exterior would melt. This is because ice absorbs a large amount of heat while it melts. All of this, combined with the ventilation that would be built into these, would basically ensure that ice houses were as close to fridges as people were going to get for a long time. Again, with wax sealing jars, the same thing holds true. An age-old concept that was actually far ahead of its time. It's all just a pretty clever use of the natural properties of these things, really. Wax forms a barrier between air and your food, and that means you don't have to worry about any airborne contamination or any bacteria getting the air they need to survive. Plus, what a lot of people would do is melt the wax and pour it over the food. Cold isn't the only thing you can trap inside things like ice houses. You can do the same to heat in things like melted wax. Not only would this sterilize the wax, it would kill off most bacteria on the surface of the jar too. There were loads of cultural traditions around farm families that basically let them use wax jars as much as they could, alongside a strong artistic appeal. Some people would use specialty wax jars for high-quality jams, honey, or other kinds of gourmet products. In the 70s, there was kind of a return for things like this, but they couldn't keep up with modern technology, so they eventually were left behind once again. Looks like we're going to be dealing with some millennia-old classics for a while. Sprouting grains is probably older than the last two combined, and it basically works as a steroid for your grains. You soak, germinate, and sprout the grains, and this does a lot for them. It activates enzymes like amylase and protease, and then they break down complex carbs, fats, and proteins. Not sure what all that means? Basically, you turn on the things that help break your food down and turn it a lot more digestible. Naturally, germination also has been known to make the vitamins that are already there in fruits even more effective. Vitamins B and C get the highest effect out of this, though the science on that one is lost to me too. Not only was sprouting grains a big idea during colonial America, but it was something that became a mainstream practice during the Great Depression and War era thanks to the way people were sharing any and all information, including long-held family traditions just to survive another day and keep their pantry going. You've heard this one 1,000 times before, and for good reason too. People dry their herbs because it's simply one of the best, oldest, and most effective ways of removing any excess moisture, keeping all that icky, bacterial nonsense off of your herbs, and making sure that your greens last as long as you need them to. You're here for the why, though, and that's what I'm here to answer for you. When you dry herbs, you reduce their overall water content. As we've discussed already, a bunch of harmful bacteria and microorganisms desperately need water and air to survive, and in that regard, they're really not so different from us. Volatile oils, on the other hand, are what give herbs and aromatics their flavor and scents. This is why you've probably heard folk tips such as boiling herbs to clear out odors. High temperatures cause these essentials to leak out, so the opposite, which in this case is proper drying, actually helps maintain these oils in the herbs, sealing all that flavor and fragrance in. In Native American traditions, their herbalists used to dry herbs to ensure that treatments, ointments, medicinal balms, and herb-based remedies were available to the community all year round. Yarrow and chamomile, for example, were and still are big-time staples of household remedies. During World War II, these practices were adopted by the mainstream to help Victory Gardens provide more produce that would last longer as well. So, it might be a basic trick, but it's got a lot of benefits and history behind it. On the other hand, pemmican is a traditional food developed by indigenous peoples of North America. They were a very ideal way to preserve meat, fat, and berries all in one for long-term storage, and it's probably one of the earliest examples we have of portable food that was put in a compact form because it needed to. It was ideal for travel, trading, and quick consumption, all factors that American industries and companies would keep in mind going forward. How does all this work, though? Bison, deer, and elk are all good sources of lean meat and were herded by indigenous peoples for a long time. All the meat from these animals would be dried, either through sun-drying it or through smoking it. In place of that, rendered fat like tallow would be mixed with the powdered dried meat, and this would seal the meat, preventing any air from interacting with it and excess moisture ruining the drying process. Berries also would contain acidic compounds and antioxidants that would help kill microbe activity overall and help reduce spoilage, and the final mix of this would be molded into cakes and balls and put into compact containers. If you made pemmican properly, it could actually last all year or even more than that, and it was packed with all kinds of nutrition that were important for a nomadic lifestyle. In short, this was a wonder food, and it was built to take care of everything you would need nutritionally. If you would bury root vegetables in the crown, then you were literally taking advantage of the natural regulation of the earth. This was a common practice that people did to keep vegetables as fresh as they could be and extend their shelf life, and it was something you'd see a lot throughout the winter. Basically, in the colder months, since the ground tends to maintain a consistently cool temperature, it helps slow the metabolic process of most vegetables down. This helps to stave off the decaying process, but the temperature of the soil during the winter is actually a lot lower than you think. It's literally just a few degrees Fahrenheit above the freezing point, and this way, not only do you get to preserve your fruit, but the overall nutritional content and texture get preserved too. Most vegetables also really need to be hydrated properly, or they'll shrivel up and die, and soil acts as a natural wellspring of moisture, so you get that covered easily. Just buying and using olive oil isn't enough. You need to also seal it properly, which can help the olive oil maintain its overall flavor. Why do you need to do this? Well, again, oxidation. Get used to it, man. We're going to be hearing a lot of it. It basically ruins the vibe of your olive oil completely because it destroys the compounds that give the oil its flavor, aroma, and health benefits, and basically means you waste your money. The fatty acids you have in your olive oil do not click well with oxygen at all. So the next question is, how do you store your olive oil properly? Now, the best thing to do is just to use an airtight container that doesn't let any kind of oxygen in. You want to ideally be using tight-fitting lids or glass bottles with tight caps. Tin over plastic is also pretty okay. You'd want to store the olive oil in a tin container though. The best thing is actually to get a dark container because this is the lesser-known fact about olive oil. Light, well, more so, the UV rays in light actually help to degrade olive oil by making oxidation a lot easier. You want to ideally store your olive oil in containers with dark colors that can limit the amount of light exposure it gets. Have you ever noticed how people have dark green jars and usually store their olive oil in small quantities? Yeah, now you know why? Now, you've probably heard your grandmother emphasize the importance of always keeping your pasta dry. But have you ever thought about why that is? The thing with drying pasta is that besides just avoiding basic issues like how it clumps together, becomes the worst thing ever to eat, and just loses its freshness, you really just want to preserve pasta because of one simple concept: moisture content. Like we've discussed before, moisture is something that bacteria and mold need desperately to grow. If they don't get it, they're liable to have a breakdown, figuratively and literally. This is why drying pasta has been such a tradition in Italian culture and just about everywhere that popularly consumes it. Drying your pasta reduces the water content by a good 15%, and that helps the pasta achieve a much higher shelf life. I'm talking months, and if you really know how to preserve, then even years. Don't believe me? Trust me, there's an Italian on YouTube with an essay on it. So, this one might take you for a spin, and I'm not sure if most of you would even be familiar with the concept. Potting your butter is a pretty historical technique, but not one that's especially popular in United States history or culture. The idea this time around is to take something like a jar or a crock and store your butter in that, and then cover it with a generous layer of clarified fat. This can either be lard or the clarified fat that comes from the butter itself, but the reason for doing this is that the layer acts as a seal. It helps to keep the butter fresh, and that's because the water and milk solids from butter are removed. What you get is pure, unadulterated butterfat left. Since it is pure, it's less likely to spoil in comparison to whole butter. Protecting it from the air also does the usual routine of keeping it safe from airborne germs and microbes. People used to do this a lot because in rural areas, even when refrigeration was a thing, it hadn't become a widespread or accessible practice. In cold places, for example, the mountain ranges here, storing these pots in dark basements would help push the shelf life up even more. Honey preservation is basically one of the few bounties of nature that will almost never betray you. It's good for your skin. It helps to boost your gut health. It doesn't ever go bad. And now I'm going to tell you all about how it preserves itself better than anything else. So, the thing with honey is that the super low moisture content in honey basically makes it impossible for any of the icky and nasty stuff we've gone over so far to grow or even get a chance to come into existence. Honey's also really acidic, and it falls anywhere between 3.2 and 4.5 on the pH scale. This helps to curb stomp the growth of any gross bacteria and fungi, so it's got a natural preservative quality in that. Anything that's got a strong acidic background naturally will do that. But honey works better for a few other reasons, like how honey naturally exudes something called glucose oxidase. When you combine this with just glucose, or sugar, you get hydrogen peroxide. This is a natural microbe hunter, and it basically destroys bacteria on sight. Honey has a high sugar content already and is largely made up entirely of glucose and fructose, so go figure. Long story short, the thing is just built different and built strong. Lye curing your fish has been the alkaline all-rounder for all your fish preservation-related needs for centuries. This traditional preservation method takes full advantage of lye and shows you just how much of an MVP it really is. This process actually goes back to the very early times of Asian cultures, and the reason behind how this works is pretty interesting. Lye as an alkaline solution raises the pH level of a fish by like 2-folds, and this would typically look like the fish being treated in a diluted solution of lye that's been mixed with water and salt. Basically, fish has a lot of protein in it, which, haha, is no surprise, right? What you might not know is that the alkalinity of lye disrupts that protein and makes it a lot more resistant to spoilage. It changes the whole structure, so now you don't just have protein, you have Protein Pro. Get it? I'll see myself out. Anyway, it doesn't just do those enhancements. It also boosts your catch of the day's resistance to those filthy microbes that keep popping up every 2 minutes. Pretty neat, right? Now, cheese aging more or less has the same deal. Maturing cheese over time to give each wheel its own unique flavor, personality, and profile is an Italian hobby that probably predates the country's own existence, but in America it was brought on over during the 20th century. The science behind cheese aging basically has a lot to do with breaking down the fat of your regular unchecked milk fats into free fatty acids, which for our purposes, let's just say they have a lot more taste and flavor. Now, the other process is proteolysis, and during the entire cheese aging, enzymes that were taken from the milk and the bacterial cultures used to make the cheese help to break down the proteins that are there. It does the same thing as before, and the longer this goes on, the stronger those flavors become. That's why they really let those things sit for years, because it's basically a game of patience. The one who waits the longest gets the best cheese. Rennet preservation, on the other hand, is a whole different animal. Rennet is an enzyme that's traditionally made from ruminant animals like cows, goats, and sheep. It helps to make cheese because it coagulates milk and causes the proteins in it to curdle and separate. This transformation is pretty much the sole reason why fresh milk even becomes cheese, and I'm going to explain to you how all this works. So, when you mix rennet with milk, it has the enzyme rennin in it. This specifically hits the primary protein in milk, which is casein. Imagine if somebody basically made really specific cuts in your limbs, causing the rest of your body to clump together. Maybe not the most descriptive example, but that's pretty much what happens. What you get left with is whey, and that's drained off. The leftover curds are then processed into different types of cheese. See, people didn't do this because they really love cheese, though. They did it because it was the ideal way to use your milk. Milk would spoil incredibly fast, and for people who were either living a very day-to-day life, taking it as it comes, that just wasn't fitting in with their routines or priorities. Freezing in snow is self-explanatory, but there's actually a bit more that goes on there besides what meets the eye and what common sense would tell you up front. People relied on freezing in snow, and yes, preserving food in snow, especially meats and proteins, thanks to the insulation properties and temperature regulation, was a fantastic idea. Just some good old-fashioned human resourcefulness and ingenuity rising to the occasion. Love to see it, right? While there's not a lot to say about the scientific aspect of all of this, there is a lot to talk about when it comes to the cultural aspect. See, this became a community hobby for people that lived in predominantly cold areas, ones with long winters, or people who just lived in rural places and communities away from urban hubs and industrialization. Gathering snow, making snow caves, storing the meat properly, packing it. All of this became a tradition that was spread through families, and it honestly brought people closer together. While I get that just hearing about it in a video might not drive that point home, but if you take a look at how people were living in rural communities before refrigeration, then it's actually sweet. Kids would help out with making pockets in the snow, adults would spend their day cleaning the meat for the community, and it was all just this nice, fair division of responsibility that taught everyone to work, care for food, and gave them some neat skills. Drying your meat and fish in the wind has also been a pretty cultural practice of people who live lives dependent on hunting, gathering, and community-based living. Drying in the wind actually works better because the wind accelerates the evaporation process by getting rid of the moisture that your protein, fish, red meat, or chicken releases on its own. You want to keep it like this because the moving air makes the moisture go away as soon as it releases, making sure it stays chronically dehydrated. Fish, especially the ones that were caught in coastal cities and regions, also used to be gutted and split open and then hung out to dry. This would help the brine enhance the flavor and also make the fish overall easier to carry and transport. Besides that, there were lots of issues with this though. It was really only ideal in warm or moist climates. In cold ones, the humidity had to be low and the air had to be pretty crisp. Also, you had to keep moving and turning the fish or meat so that it would dry evenly and that the moisture was even going away. If you didn't do this, you risked spoiling it yourself. I think there are better ways of drying, but this wasn't a trick that would apply to people like you or me anyway. So I know for a fact you've never heard about this one before. Animal bladders being used to vacuum pack is definitely the most ancient preservation method I have on this entire list, and this is all thanks to the natural God-gifted sealing ability of the bladder. Basically, the bladder from large animals like pigs, deer, and cows was the one people used the most because of how flexible and elastic it would be. The bladder would be taken out, cleaned, and then opened. You would then tie or stitch it after the food was packed inside, and the key to preserving this was to remove the air from inside the bladder because, again, you don't want those nasty bacteria getting any air they don't deserve. The bladder would even be inflated by people so that people could get a bit more space for the food. Plus, the vacuum effect created thanks to the bladder being removed meant that it was the ideal environment for not spoiling the food. If we talk about history, then people like early explorers and fur traders would rely on bladders for trade and would pass them to nomadic tribes and communities traveling through the areas. It was also very popular in Arctic regions. There are many risks though, and it requires a lot of skill, because if you don't clean it properly, you just risk contamination badly. So, cold smoking your meat is a tried and tested method of making sure your meat lasts the long haul, no matter how rough it might get. These are techniques that have been proven to work by several cultures around the world throughout history, so you can definitely trust in their authenticity. What really is cold smoking, though? Basically, it involves exposing your meat to smoke that's from a temperature around 68 to 86 Fahrenheit, and that's a lot lower than the smoke that usually comes from warm fires. Cold smoking can't cook the meat, but what it does do is give the meat a pretty nice flavor and dry it out. We've already gone over why drying your meat out is such a good idea. But cold smoking was done via smoking chambers that were specifically built for this purpose. It was honestly a wonderful way of adding an incredible amount of flavor to your food. And thanks to coupling it with things like curing your meats with additional salts and drying them out, you get to have long-lasting, good-tasting meat for the majority of your next few months. Now, the next thing we have is packing your meat in saltwater brine. The reason this works is because saltwater brine is a method of preserving food by submerging it in a mix of salt, water, and ingredients like herbs and spices for aromatics. Salt pretty much gets rid of any kind of moisture that you don't need and makes an environment that promotes longevity in your protein by getting rid of any bacteria that would cause spoilage. The concentration of salt is around 10%, and when dissolved in water, you basically get a bath with some really nice preserving effects. Curing ingredients, like the ones used in cold smoking meats, are often things like sugar, nitrates, or spices that people would add to the brine. This would help add flavor and make sure the meat keeps its color, just like how we discussed before when nitrates came up. Brining would typically take a while, but that would depend on the kind of meat you were using and its size. It wasn't really just people who were living centuries ago that did this. Lots of indigenous communities, nomadic people, and even upscale restaurants still use brining as a technique to either preserve meat or to increase its lifespan. Brining helps to bring flavors out because the meat stays submerged for so long, the flavors get infused. The next time you want to figure out how to take your meat up a notch, maybe try a saltwater brine. We're going to end the list on an age-old trick, and I'm sure some of you can already guess. You pickle in vinegar, and yes, the cartoons, the movies, and your grandparents were all right. It really does work. A lot better than we'd like to think, really. You can soak just about any kind of food in this too. You can even throw in eggs and meat, not just vegetables and different kinds of fruits. This solution of vinegar, salt, and water, as well as sugar and spices, results in this really tangy and sour flavor, which for some is an acquired taste, but it extends the shelf life of whatever you're cooking with by miles. So the pickling solution involves white vinegar with water and salt. Some people throw in garlic, dill, and coriander or peppercorns in there. The vinegar and water mix can either be heated or just poured cold, but the important part, and really the one where all the magic happens, is when you submerge it. The acidity of the vinegar helps to preserve the food a lot, while the sealing ensures that it stays fresh. Depending on the spices you throw in, your fruit or meat can get a lot more flavorful too. In the South of America, loads of people would pickle okra or cucumbers or even beets, especially during the Depression. They made such good appetizers, they were convenient to carry, and they helped things last longer. Honestly, it's just a win-win-win-win all around. And what else can you ask for in life? One of the most widespread hacks that got around like wildfire in the USA was the idea of speeding up the process of caramelizing onions by adding in some baking soda. Baking soda is a handy tool for many tasks, like softening vegetables or removing pesky stains. In the case of onions, it creates a pretty volatile pH environment, which helps the onions brown faster, better, and with a much richer flavor. This has to do with onions being more alkaline post-baking soda, and that really helps speed up the browning process. If you want to cut down on the prep time of your food without sacrificing the taste, and you find yourself putting in caramelized onions a lot, then this is one hack from Grandma to us to you. Dandelion salad might sound like a fairy tale-like name for an incredibly frugal but delicious meal. By now, you might have noticed the scavenger vibe in terms of ingredients of the dishes so far. People making anything out of whatever they had on hand. Economic downturns often feature lifestyle changes, and the Great Depression was no other, sending people on a scramble to find and eat anything. Dandelion salad took scramble seriously as the meal involved finding and foraging dandelions. You would cut out all the roots, flowers, and waste to make the dressing for a very healthy salad. For people, especially those on a diet and a budget, this was a godsend. For a garnish, all people would usually put on it was lemon juice and olive oil, a dash of salt, and you were good to go at basically no cost. The classic roast beaver tail. Now, I know this one sounds a tad bit unusual right off the bat, but this meaty meal was once a cornerstone of survival for Native Americans and early settlers. Imagine this, trading a juicy steak for a flat, scaly beaver tail. But hey, survival is survival. They said it tasted like pork rinds, so maybe it wasn't as bad as it sounds. Beaver tails were roasted over an open flame until the skin was crisp and the fat underneath rendered down. Beavers were a crucial resource for Native American tribes, and they didn't let any part of the rodent go to waste, not even the tails. Roast beaver tail wasn't just sustenance. It was a delicacy among American Indians and trappers. The best part? It wasn't just finger-licking delicious, but also provided a high-energy meal for those braving the frontier. Today, it's almost entirely forgotten as chicken has taken over the dinner table. The typical scrambled eggs breakfast has been more or less a national tradition for so many years, it is impossible to tell where it really started. Low-key, small-time diners, high-tier French-American restaurants, and steakhouses all serve some kind of variation on eggs, including scrambled-ons. Hence, what do you do to add a little bit of variety, texture, and a bit of spaz to this classical option? If mayonnaise can work wonders for a burger, why not try it here? No, seriously, you'd be surprised. We know most people never make the link between eggs and mayo, but they can actually make them so much more fluffier and add this nice creamy texture too. If you do not believe us, then just search up any grandma's recipe for mayo eggs. Do not knock it till you try it. Vinegar pie is the rather odd dish on this list that proves that at times of desperation, anyone will eat anything. Vinegar pie started spreading infectiously out of states like Pennsylvania in the start of the 1930s and tops even dandelion salad when it comes to being budget-friendly. All you would need is an open crust, vinegar, sugar, and some eggs to create this unique pie. To cover the mediocre taste, people would coat the crust with a meringue. It was an affectionate treat to bring in case of a celebration and was easy to make if you had a sweet craving. The dish was also pretty delicious if you were able to get over the sour vinegar taste and focus on the meringue. People really wanted a sweet treat at the end of a hard week spent cutting corners and working long hours, and small joys like vinegar pies were what kept people sustained. Jellied eels were a staple on the dinner table back in the 1900s. This dish was whipped up in London in the 18th century, when a bored chef decided to mix things up a bit. Here's the thing. Eels were dirt cheap back in the day, so they were everyone's favorite source of meat. The dish consisted of chopped eels boiled in a spiced stock and allowed to cool and set, forming a jelly. It was usually served cold and made a good substitute for dessert. Since it was light on the pockets, the English loved to serve it at dinner parties and festivals. It also made its way out to other parts of Europe, such as Denmark and Sweden, which came up with their own versions of the jelly. You won't find a lot of people talking about jellied eels now, because it has largely disappeared from the British menus. But hey, if you're ever feeling adventurous enough, I say give this one a try. This is one you have definitely heard about. Popeyes, Wendy's, KFC, or Burger King, there is nothing that hits that sweet spot in every corner of your head like some fried chicken does. Something about it makes it the perfect marriage between seasonings, oil, chicken, and breadcrumbs. You have probably tried this yourself too, but using baking powder on that chicken skin can get you some extra crispy zingers ready to go. Perfect for sandwiches, burgers, or just some chicken katsu curry. Ever feel like doing something extra with your chicken fillet? You know what to pull out of the cabinets. There's never been anything bad that came out of too much crispiness, except cholesterol issues and heart problems, but that's for like when you are 60 or something. Potato pancakes are one that we are very sad to have seen fade away from the arsenal of home chefs. Pancakes made with matzo or applesauce topped with garlic or fried onions made for such a mouth-watering meal. Low-income households back in those times were struggling to buy produce. Farmers' markets were uniformly unaffordable for middle-income households due to creeping inflation. People needed a vegetable that was cost-appropriate and easy to make in batches. Enter the potato pancake, which revolutionized the breakfast scene in a struggling time. As times improved, people slowly started going to more fancier and creative breakfasts, unfortunately leaving simpler dishes behind. Potato pancakes took a backseat in the face of changing food and economic trends, but anyone from the era will rave to you about the godsend these were. Straight out of the royal family's dinner table, beef Wellington was a beef steak dish with the perfect regal twist. This delicacy was made of a tender beef fillet coated with pâté and duxelles, then wrapped in puff pastry, which made it just as fancy as it sounds. It was traditionally served with a rich red wine sauce, such as a Madeira or Cabernet Sauvignon reduction. Now, the origin of this meal is shrouded in history, but it is suggested that it emerged in England in the 19th century and was named after the Duke of Wellington, Arthur Wellesley. This steak required a lot of time and patience, which made it a meal for only the royals of England. It's a part of ancient history now, but you might be able to taste it if you make your way to Regal Balls or a Michelin star restaurant in London. Sometimes your fridge gets a due date for the scrapyard much earlier than it should. Sometimes the gas runs out and you are left debating a crisis. Do I let all my frozen stuff, my protein, and my milk go to waste? Or do I take some inspiration from my ancestors and try a neat little milk preservation hack? The next time you find yourself on the edge of a dairy disaster, try placing your bottled milk in a bowl of cold water. This next step is baby levels of difficulty. All you need is a wet cloth placed around the edges. Gets rid of those nasty bacteria, gets rid of your milk gone stale worries. We think it is an all-around win-win. Boiled carrot sandwiches was created from the weird culinary gap left by increasing prices and thinner savings accounts. Like we said, people wanted vegetables that ticked the cheaper and tastier most boxes for them. However, even that was getting tough. Some of the worst stretches of the Great Depression left people with frustrations and creativity alike. Whipping up dishes like this was common, and the boiled carrot sandwich definitely stayed during the time because of its simplicity. Americans love a good sandwich, and they adore an easy-to-cook filling. Boiled carrot sandwiches definitely met most of the criteria, as roasting cheese to create an open-faced sandwich was a popular choice. Suffering the same fate as other dishes on this list, the boiled carrot sandwich eventually died out as economic growth increased in America. Pressed duck, a French-inspired masterpiece, is just as complex as it sounds. The dish involves cooking a duck and then using a special press to extract the blood and juices, which are then used to create a rich, flavorful sauce. You heard that right? A sauce made out of blood and bone marrow. Now, before you wrinkle your nose, this dish was a showstopper at French restaurants back in the day, and its unique taste spoke for itself. The complex dish was a specialty of Rouen, and its creation was attributed to an innkeeper from the city of Duclair. It's also known as canard à la presse, and is a specialty of the Tour d'Argent restaurant in Paris. Cooking pressed duck isn't a job for the weak and requires special time and effort, which is exactly why it has become a rare dinner time on our tables now. And then, of course, not everyone has a knack for eating a sauce made out of bone marrow. This one is similarly another one you may have not only heard of, but seen, tried, and tested for yourself. Toasting spices in a pan can do wonders for their flavor. It is like steroids with athletes, except nothing about it messes up your system. Just a little bit of toasting can really bring out every last drop of flavor from whatever spices you are working with, and the end result you get is an explosively flavorful dish that packs thrice the punch you thought it would. Sounds like a pretty good deal this time too, right? Ever thought about why this happens though? You know how spices have these oils in them, and they are largely what is responsible for that banging taste we are all used to? Once you toast them, the heat starts to draw out those oils and it kind of puts them on turbo mode. Cumin gets more healthy, chilies are no longer just spicy enough to make your eyes water, but sweet and smoky too, and coriander really gets flavor. Prune pudding was one of the more niche dishes that were created during the Great Depression. What really was surprising was that prune pudding extended to the upper royalty as well, since even prominent VIPs would also be real low budget with how they eat. Prune pudding became very popular as a result of the efforts made by First Lady Eleanor Roosevelt, who would serve prune pudding at White House functions. It stained the White House's culinary track record, sure, but earned massive points with the struggling American people. For being made of such a simple ingredient and some syrups of your choice, it was definitely one of the tastiest and cheapest meals to come home to. Here's a patty grilling technique endorsed by the culinary virtuoso himself, Gordon Ramsay. You get some nice beef patties perfectly shaped, seasoned, and ready to be slapped onto the grill for the most divine homemade burger you have had in the past 5 years. Turns out it was a bit too humid, the meat was a little dry, and the grilling took away all the moisture. You end up with a dry, chewy patty that does neither your teeth nor your taste buds any favors. So what's an honest burger lover to do? Put some ice cubes on that bad boy and let it grill. You will genuinely be shell-shocked at the results. The whole thing here is that it keeps that moisture locked into the patty, so the burger stays constantly juicy throughout the process from the moment you put it on the grill to the moment it hits your plate. It is not like you have anything to lose by trying except like 4 ice cubes, so give this a shot. And remember, you can always take Ramsay's word for it too. Egg drop soup for some royal courts was a show of a chef's skill. In 1930, America, the soup became a beloved soup of the masses who were struggling to make an honest paycheck. Bread from last night and eggs beaten so thoroughly that the preparation itself doubled as a forearm workout resulted in an incredibly rich soup. Sometimes, if a home cook felt particularly fancy, they would have chicken either boiled or shredded in the mix. Using the chicken stock was also a common way to not let anything go to waste, since getting the most bang for your buck out of poultry became a habit of everyone. Most would just have this with eggs and throw in some ginger, chives and olives, or anchovies. We would definitely like to see this make a comeback with a less cost-oriented version that really explores the dish. Now, the French weren't fans of the rabbit pie, so they decided to whip up a pigeon pie instead. This delicacy dates all the way back to the 17th century when James Hart, a Scottish physician, wrote in 1633 that pigeon pies were usually served with far too much pepper. It became an instant hit after Hart's paper, and people started cutting down on the pepper a bit. This crispy dish was a savory game pie made of pigeon meat and various other ingredients traditional to French cuisine. The buttery crust made it a luxurious treat which was common on banquet tables. It was a tradition for wives to make pigeon pie after their husbands spent long days hunting for the delicious bird. But hey, tastes change, and so do our feathered friends. Just like breadcrumbs have become synonymous with providing the perfect golden, crunchy exterior, crushed cornflakes have the same reputation from our grandparents' days. Most things you would add this to, like chicken fillets or strips, would get significantly more crunchier and crispier. And the coating did not taste as much like cereal as you are thinking it would. It actually just tasted like pretty good skin, the kind that crumbles and falls apart in your mouth as you bite into it. Probably the biggest benefit of your grandma cooking things up this way was that it really cut down on the grease factor. That can leave even the most loyal, crispy chicken lover feeling bloated, oily, and a little turned off for the day. Ever wondered what the ultimate American comfort food was back in the day? Well, the only right answer is the veal and ham pie. This hearty pie combined the delicate flavors of veal with the salty goodness of ham. The pie's popularity surged during the Victorian era. It originated in the kitchens of English settlers and was a practical choice for using up leftovers, but soon became a meal for the elite. While it was a luxurious delicacy in England, it was a staple in large households in America. Not only was it easy to whip up, but was also cheap to make, which made it perfect for communal gatherings and large families. If you want to give your grandparents a rush of nostalgia, ask them about this meaty goodness, and who knows, your grandma might even dust off some cookbooks. Cabbage and noodles typically just looked like a pound of cabbage and a medium serving of noodles. More or less, it was not the most expensive dish, and you could enjoy a bowl by making it pretty quickly. Away from the pancake and pie-addled fanatics or admirers of noodles across the states, everyone needs their cravings satisfied from time to time, even if the soaring prices spared no one. In some areas, cabbage and noodles was known as haluski. However, in most places, it was simply referred to as cabbage and noodles, the most typical Depression-era noodle recipe. It's a must-have that needed to be in your repertoire if you were to survive the times and not forget every taste you ever loved. Someone really needs to study how times like these bring out everyone's culinary creativity. Squirrel stew might sound unusual today, but it was a popular dish in rural areas. Yep, our bushy-tailed friends were once a common ingredient in many kitchens. Also known as Brunswick stew, it was a tomato-based stew generally involving local beans, vegetables, and originally small game meat such as squirrel. However, many variations from around the world used rabbit meat too. The origin of this meaty stew is controversial at best, as the states of Virginia and Georgia both claim its birth, with Brunswick County in Virginia and the city of Brunswick in Georgia claiming it was developed there. To keep things peaceful, let's just say Virginia and Georgia both played a role in creating this delicious stew. Squirrel meat was easily hunted and provided a necessary source of protein. With the rise of chicken, squirrel stew has fallen out of flavor. But hey, this one is pretty easy to whip up and will satisfy your Thursday night meat cravings like no other. Speaking of turnoffs, something that detracts from all the maritime goodness fish has to offer is that offensive odor that tends to come with most seafood you will catch. Funnily enough, soaking your fish in milk can quickly eliminate that issue. Look, there is no easy way to say it. It stinks, and it stinks bad. It is not something you would want with your food, much less constantly oozing out of your fridge every time you open it. Grandmas did know that fish is too essential of a superfood to just cut out of the diets of growing healthy kids, though. Naturally, they did what they do best and scoured the ends of the culinary world looking for a way to solve the problem. The answer was always much closer to them than they would think, almost right under their nose. When you soak fish in milk for about 20 minutes, it bonds with the protein in the milk and the compounds in the fish responsible for that ghastly smell stick with the beverage afterwards. When you extract it, you get a clean-tasting fish with none of that ridiculous funk. Bean soup is different from the other soups on our list because, in contrast, bean soup was pretty simple to make. Dried red kidney beans in a thick soup made for a favorite of states like Idaho, where the dish originated from. You could find different ideas on the soup from house to house, as some had their vegetables as toppings and others had meats. Fred Dubois, who was Idaho's senator at one point, passed a bill that mandated the Senate restaurant to have bean soup on the menu every day. Definitely one way to start a movement if you ask us, but the trend definitely stuck around after it gained steam. It was an amazing way for low-income neighborhoods to eat healthy, but nowadays you would not find it in households as beans are not really the go-to item for soups. If you think the beef heart is off-limits for cuisine, you're wrong, because stuffed hearts were once a celebrated dish. This dish sounds like something out of a horror movie, but it was actually quite common. Think of the beef heart cleaned, stuffed with a mixture of breadcrumbs, herbs, and often pine nuts or raisins, and then roasted or braised. Sounds appetizing yet? This economical and tasty meal was a testament to the nose-to-tail philosophy of cooking, where no part of the animal was wasted. In Europe, the practice of stuffing animal hearts dates back to medieval times. It was a popular dish amongst the working class in England, while it was reserved for the elite in France. Eating hearts isn't as common today, but if you ever tried this one, you'd understand the hype. A golden rule passed down from grandmother to mother, and eventually to our generation, is that whenever you're cooking carbs like pasta or spaghetti noodles, you drizzle in a little olive oil. The trick here this time is that it prevents the noodles from sticking together, and we all like our noodles with extra twirling ability. Stacking up loads of pasta on a fork for a massive bite is one of the joys of pasta, to be honest. And that can only work if they are not all stuck together like somebody poured in hot glue. Olive oil can do literal wonders for this little problem that dominates most pasta-based dishes. And if you are new to it and want to make some killer Alfredo, remember to try this out. Creamed chipped beef on toast, however, was a more happening kind of toast-based breakfast. Particularly fancy and skillful home cooks would smoke the meat sometimes to add a better BBQ flavor. Thin slices of beef in glass jars were all you needed, which were not too expensive, and the rest of the dish was completed with a creamy, thick white sauce. Meat lovers would use cayenne pepper, remembering days where they could spray it on their steaks instead of their toast. Comfort food was really lacking in the Depression times because most could not make theirs. Creamed chipped beef on toast was a wonderful replacement that we are still sad to see fade away to history. Depending on where you were, the dish was more rare because you would most often see it in middle to upper middle class households. Beef really was expensive back then, but nowadays lots of other beef-based breakfasts took its spot. Elk roast was all the rage for Native American tribes. Elk is native to North America and parts of Asia, and people have relied on it as a food source for centuries. You know, back when cattle weren't common in the States. This roast was a favorite in regions where elk was abundant, and its sacred recipe was passed down from generation to generation. So, why was it such a hit back in the day? Well, apart from the tribe's sacred connections to the animal which made it a favorite, it was pretty easy to make too. It was often slow-cooked over hot coals. Think of it as modern-day barbecue, just without all the fancy grills and tools. Elk meat was replaced by more readily available options like beef and pork. It's a shame, really, because elk roast can be a delicious and healthy meal. So you could not finish up all your pizza in one go, but you bet the gang that you needed an entire large one to yourself. It happens to the best of us, but do not let overestimation trap you into forcefully eating soggy leftover pizza. Reheat it in a skillet and get that crust crispy, fresh, and warm, all in one go. Just because something is a leftover does not mean you have to completely sacrifice the original quality. You can still get a lot of bang for your buck if you take the time to heat it the old-fashioned way. We know microwaves are convenient, almost dangerously so, but they cannot do everything that gas-based fire and kitchen utensils can. So if you really do not feel like sitting through mushy, soggy pizza crusts, you know what to do now. Braised oxtail is proof that our ancestors really knew how to make the most of every part of an animal. An oxtail typically weighs around 8 pounds and is skinned and cut into shorter lengths for this Italian cuisine. This meat is slow-cooked in red wine and braised with vegetables such as carrots, tomatoes, and even lima beans. Oxtail is packed with collagen, so this dish was also used by many women of the Victorian era for younger-looking skin. Many women used to throw parties just to serve it. They took eat your skincare to a whole other level. While the word once meant only the tail of an ox, today it can also refer to the tails of other cattle. Today, this dish is a gourmet delicacy, but back in the day, it was every middle-class worker's dream. Milk toast is exactly what the name suggests. Toasted to perfection bread dipped in milk with a generous slap of butter. On days when any meal you loved was unaffordable and getting up to cook something proper was dreadful, milk toast came through for many families. All you needed was some good fresh bread and a warm glass of milk to gorge on until you felt full. Milk toast quickly became one of the most popular breakfasts in the States, catering specifically to people below the poverty line who could not make most of the items on this list regularly. Nowadays, this might be considered a very vintage meal, the type to get kids asking you what century you might be from. But back then, it was something even working-class 20-year-olds would eat daily. Times have changed, and the breakfast of people in those socioeconomic classes is definitely different. Bear meat might seem like something out of a survivalist's handbook, but it was once a prized delicacy in many cultures. The roast loin of bear was considered a special occasion dish, reserved for feasts and celebrations. This dish has deep roots in the culinary traditions of the early American settlers. As you can imagine, hunting a bear was a daunting task, so this meal was a reward for bravery. Apart from the hunting of the bears, this one wasn't complicated to whip up. All you needed was the loin, which is the tender strip of meat along the backbone, which was often roasted over an open fire. Now, this is one meaty dish. Well, it doesn't take rocket science to know why this one has vanished from our tables. I bet you're not up to the task of hunting a bear, are you? Something that is ridiculously common in Southeast Asian households in America, but a little less known to natives of Uncle Sam's residence, is that rinsing your rice with water can do wonders for any dish. Literally, any dish that involves even the slightest hint of rice. This is because rinsing removes the extra starch packed into rice, giving you fluffier grains with minimal effort. If you are the type of person who enjoys their rice soft, airy, and mushy, then this is one kitchen hack you need to try. This time, you can thank brown grandmas for passing it on to the mainstream. Even culinary scientists like Matt Slem vouch for this, and just like with sticky pasta, nobody enjoys eating sticky rice. Oatmeal cakes are a warm, fuzzy childhood dish that many might associate with visits to their grandparents. Failing economy on one side, and grandma spoiling her favorite niece and nephew on the other. You just know they will always find a way, and lucky enough for us that the people of the times did it so craftily. In 35 minutes, you had a wondrous dessert to yourself that was quick enough to make after long, panic-filled days. Canned oatmeal on a soft cake glazed with an almond or peanut topping really set hearts on fire. Despite the cake's popularity back then, especially in the fitness and health community, it still did not stand the test of the time. Of course, it is a great way to spice up your oatmeal, regardless of how other breakfasts prepared with more culinary liberties taken would eventually replace it. While we're on the topic of bizarre, meaty meals, hog's head cheese is another crazy one on the list. Now, don't let the name confuse you because the meal doesn't contain any cheese or in fact any dairy products at all. It is made with flesh from the head of a pig, typically set in aspic and usually eaten cold, at room temperature, or in a sandwich. The parts of the head used do not commonly include the brain, eyes, or ears, but everything else? It's all in there somewhere. This unique meat jelly originated somewhere in ancient Germany and instantly made its way to other parts of Europe. Many recipes use a bit of lemon juice to add a bit more flavor to the jelly. It's not a part of our dinner tables anymore, and I don't know about you, but a lot of people want to keep it this way. Too much raisins can be pretty bad for you, despite what clickbait articles on the internet or Instagram info dumps will have you believe, unless you cook them the right way, which is by soaking them in some hot water before you get to baking. Something you must have noticed by now, whether we are dealing with fried chicken and pizza or rice and ground beef patties, is that every kind of food has the potential to get significantly better depending on the prep. If you just take a little bit of time out to add some things, soak them, place them in a proper container, and try a few hacks, then you can find yourself having a much better dish. In this case, the hot water makes them plumpier and amps up their properties as a natural laxative. You the type to struggle with digestion? This is a hack for you, plus all the other benefits like taming your sweet cravings or boosting your bone strength. Seems like Grandma really did know what was best for our bodies. Squirrel stew is also called Brunswick stew, which might be a more familiar name since it is very well known in the South. Squirrel stew typically has much more positive associations than the ones it is tied to in the Great Depression era. In some areas that were struck exceptionally badly, it was hard to get any kind of meat. Stews had already been made with tomatoes, onions, and other basic vegetables that were available, but they were missing protein. Using squirrel in stews began to be widely incorporated into the daily meals of families following the onset of the Depression. The poor neighborhoods relied on variations of this stew that worked with what they had for regular nutrition. You have to consider that these were families used to eating meat before the brunt of the era hit America, and so squirrel meat was a welcome change. Pickled beef tongue was a classic back in the day. Some love it, others not so much. Now, before you jump to any conclusions, just hear me out because it's not as bizarre as it sounds. Yeah, beef tongue was found in many national cuisines and was used for taco fillings in Mexico and for open-faced sandwiches in the United Kingdom. Beef tongue, whether braised or pickled, was a versatile dish served both hot and cold. Believe it or not, it was a staple back in the day. It actually tastes pretty good if you close your eyes and pretend you're not eating beef tongue, because that can sound a tad bit too much. It's not the healthiest meat though, because beef tongue is very high in fat, which contributes up to 72% of its caloric content. It has become rare today, but you will be surprised to see how many places still sell beef tongue burritos down in Mexico. Yikes! That wraps up the list of old preservation hacks that were ahead of their times. Which hack stood out to you the most? Comment down below and don't forget to like and subscribe.